Long before castles, before Stonehenge, before even the earliest farms were ever planted across its soil, Britain was empty. Not empty of animals. Reindeer and wild horses still roamed its valleys, but empty of people, abandoned entirely during the depths of the last ice age, when roughly 2/3 of the entire island lay buried beneath thick sheets of glacial ice, and temperatures across the exposed, unfrozen fringes remained far too harsh to sustain any lasting human community. For decades, scientists believed they knew roughly when humans finally returned to reclaim this frozen, empty landscape, piecing together an approximate timeline from scattered archaeological evidence and broader European climate records. In 2026, new research revised that timeline, pushing the date of Britain's human resettlement back by nearly 500 years. But that revised date turns out to be only the opening chapter of a considerably stranger and considerably more poignant story, because the very first people to resettle Britain after the ice retreated left behind almost no trace in the bloodline of anyone living in Britain today. Let's start with the new climate research itself, because it represents a genuinely elegant piece of scientific detective work. Researchers studying an ancient lake called Llangorse Lake, known in Welsh as Lake Siffidan, in South Wales, examined sediment layers, preserving an extraordinarily detailed environmental record stretching back roughly 19,000 years. Buried within these layers, researchers found the fossilized remains of chironomids, tiny, non-biting midge larvae whose specific species composition changes predictably according to water temperature, making them remarkably precise natural thermometers for reconstructing ancient climate conditions. By carefully analyzing these preserved chironomid remains, alongside fossil pollen and detailed lake chemistry, researchers reconstructed a startlingly abrupt climate shift. Summer temperatures across southern Britain jumped from a chilly 5 to 7 degrees Celsius to a considerably more temperate 10 to 14 degrees Celsius, and this warming appears to have occurred right around 15,200 years ago. Earlier models, based on climate records collected from other parts of northwest Europe and Greenland, had generally placed this same major warming event closer to 14,700 years ago, a difference of approximately 500 years. Published in the journal Nature Ecology and Evolution, this research suggests the specific pattern of climate warming in Britain unfolded somewhat differently and earlier than researchers had previously assumed based on evidence gathered from neighboring regions. This revised timeline matters considerably, because it directly connects to when humans actually returned to Britain. Just before this specific warming event, researchers found archaeological evidence showing that herds of reindeer and wild horses, the preferred prey of Ice Age hunters, had already begun moving into southern Britain in more consistent, detectable numbers, arriving around 15,500 years ago, exploiting fresh grazing grounds opening up as the climate began to shift. Human hunter-gatherers, tracking these same herds northward in pursuit of their primary food source, appear to have followed close behind, crossing into Britain while it remained physically connected to mainland Europe by a now-submerged landmass researchers call Doggerland. If you find it fascinating how tiny fossilized insect larvae can help scientists precisely reconstruct climate conditions from 15,000 years ago, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep bringing you carefully researched deep dives exactly like this one. So who exactly were these first pioneers, the people who resettled Britain nearly 500 years earlier than previously believed? Archaeological evidence points toward a specific, well-documented culture known as the Magdalenians, a sophisticated group of hunter-gatherers already well established across much of continental Europe by this point, known for their finely crafted stone tools, elaborate carved bone artifacts, and remarkable cave art found at sites scattered across France and Spain. This culture takes its name from a rock shelter called La Madeleine in the Dordogne region of France, first excavated back in the 19th century, and by the time these pioneers pushed north into Britain, Magdalenian communities had already developed a genuinely sophisticated toolkit, including finely worked flint blades, bone needles for sewing tailored clothing, and portable art carved directly into antler and bone, all technology and craftsmanship well suited to surviving in the harsh, rapidly shifting climate of the final millennia of the Ice Age. Reaching Britain at all required these Magdalenian hunters to cross Doggerland, a now submerged expanse of low-lying plains and river valleys that, during this period, still physically connected what is now the east coast of England to the coastlines of the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark. Doggerland would not disappear beneath the rising waters of the North Sea for several more thousand years yet, meaning the Magdalenian pioneers who resettled Britain were not undertaking any kind of dangerous sea crossing at all, but were instead simply following prey animals across open, walkable terrain that, from their perspective, would not have felt like crossing into a separate island whatsoever. At a site called Gough's Cave, located within the dramatic limestone cliffs of Cheddar Gorge in southwestern England, archaeologists have recovered extensive evidence of Magdalenian occupation, dating to approximately 15,000 years ago, remarkably close to this newly revised climate timeline. Detailed radiocarbon dating suggests the cave itself may have only been occupied seasonally, across perhaps 2 or 3 human generations at most, a relatively brief window of intensive habitation centered closely around this same critical period of climate transition. The evidence recovered from Gough's cave reveals a culture that was, in certain respects, considerably more elaborate, and in other respects, considerably more unsettling than many visitors to the modern gorge might expect. Chemical analysis of preserved bone remains confirms these early Britons subsisted primarily on large game, horses and reindeer, precisely the animals whose northward migration had drawn them into Britain in the first place. But archaeologists also recovered something else entirely at this same site. Human bones bearing clear, deliberate cut marks and skull fragments carefully modified into cup-like vessels. Researchers studying this evidence believe it points toward deliberate, ritualized cannibalism, practiced as part of this community's mortuary customs. Whether connected to funerary ritual, warfare, or some combination of both remains a subject of ongoing scholarly debate. Some researchers have proposed this practice may have served a primarily respectful ceremonial function, a specific way of honoring deceased community members by symbolically incorporating them back into the living community, broadly comparable to funerary customs, documented among certain more recent societies studied by anthropologists. Others suggest a more pragmatic explanation connected to the genuinely harsh survival pressures these communities faced, particularly during especially difficult seasons when other food sources may have grown scarce. Without written records or living descendants to consult directly, researchers must continue piecing together the true meaning behind this practice indirectly, through careful comparison with similar archaeological evidence recovered from other Magdalenian sites across continental Europe, where broadly similar patterns of modified human bone have occasionally been documented as well. In 2022, researchers achieved something genuinely remarkable, successfully extracting and sequencing genetic material directly from human remains recovered at Gough's cave, representing the oldest human DNA ever recovered from anywhere in the British Isles. There is one more genuinely charming detail connected to Gough's cave worth mentioning, one that adds an unexpectedly warm note to this otherwise fairly stark picture of Ice Age survival. In 2026, researchers revisited a jawbone recovered from the cave decades earlier, originally excavated back in the 1920s and, at the time, simply catalogued as an unremarkable wolf specimen. Modern genetic sequencing revealed this identification had been mistaken. The jawbone actually belonged to one of the oldest known domestic dogs ever identified anywhere in the world. Closely related genetically to other famous Paleolithic dog, remains found as far away as Germany and Turkey. This suggests the Magdalenian pioneers who first pushed into Britain nearly 500 years earlier than we previously realized were not traveling entirely alone. They were quite possibly accompanied by domesticated dogs, already a well-established, widespread companion species across late Ice Age Europe, walking alongside these early human pioneers as they tracked reindeer and horses into an empty, newly thawing British landscape. This individual, a genetically confirmed female, showed clear genetic ancestry connecting her directly to the broader Magdalenian population found across the European continent, closely matching genetic profiles previously recovered from sites in Belgium and Spain, part of what researchers refer to as the Goyet Q2 genetic cluster. Her mitochondrial DNA belonged to a specific maternal lineage called haplogroup U8A, also found among Magdalenian individuals recovered from multiple other European sites, confirming she genuinely belonged to this same widespread interconnected Ice Age culture that had, evidently, successfully pushed its way into Britain considerably earlier than researchers had previously assumed. Successfully recovering usable genetic material from remains, this old presented researchers with considerable technical challenges. Britain's damp, temperate climate is generally far less favorable for preserving ancient DNA compared with the colder, drier conditions found in places like Siberia or northern Scandinavia, where genetic material tends to survive in considerably better condition across long stretches of time. 15,000 years of fluctuating temperature and humidity inside Gough's cave meant that only small, highly degraded fragments of genetic material remained intact within the recovered bone samples. Researchers relied on increasingly refined laboratory extraction techniques, developed and steadily improved over the preceding decade, to isolate and sequence enough genetic material from these fragile remains to draw confident conclusions regarding this individual's broader ancestry and family relationships. The successful sequencing of this genome represented a genuine technical achievement in its own right, extending the practical limits of ancient DNA research into a climate and environment long considered particularly unfavorable for this kind of delicate genetic recovery work. If uncovering these kinds of genuinely vivid, sometimes unsettling details about our distant ancestors fascinates you the way it fascinates me, Make sure you're subscribed because there are many more carefully researched deep dives just like this one still waiting to be explored right here on this channel. Here is where Britain's story takes a genuinely unexpected and genuinely poignant turn. Roughly 1,500 years after the Magdalenian woman at Gough's Cave lived and died, researchers examined the remains of a second individual, this time recovered from Kendrick's Cave, a separate site located a considerable distance away in North Wales. Based on the archaeological layer and associated artifacts, this second individual lived approximately 13,500 years ago, considerably closer to us in time than the Gough's Cave woman, but still representing an extraordinarily ancient chapter of British prehistory. When researchers successfully sequenced this second individual's genome and compared it directly against the earlier Gough's Cave woman, they discovered something nobody had fully anticipated. Despite living in the same general region, separated by only about 1,500 years, these two individuals shared essentially no close genetic relationship whatsoever. Rather than descending from the same Magdalenian population that had first pushed into Britain, the Kendrick's Cave individual instead carried genetic ancestry connecting him to an entirely different population. Lineage that appears to have expanded into Europe from somewhere further southeast, quite possibly the Near East, and which shows its closest genetic match to remains recovered from a site called Villa Bruna in northern Italy. This genetic discontinuity was matched by equally striking cultural and dietary differences. Unlike the Magdalenian woman at Gough's Cave, whose diet centered heavily on hunted reindeer and horse meat, chemical analysis of the Kendrick's Cave individual's bones revealed a diet rich in fish and other marine resources, an entirely different way of surviving within the same broader landscape. Even the treatment of the dead differed considerably between these two sites, with no evidence at Kendrick's Cave of the kind of elaborate bone modification and probable cannibalism documented at Gough's Cave. Taken together, this evidence points towards something genuinely striking, an almost complete population replacement occurring within Britain across a remarkably short span of time, geologically and archaeologically speaking. The original Magdalenian pioneers, the very people whose arrival researchers have now dated nearly 500 years earlier than previously believed, appear to have largely vanished from Britain, replaced by an entirely distinct population carrying no meaningful genetic connection back to those original settlers. As Professor Ian Barnes of the Natural History Museum's Ancient DNA Laboratory, who worked directly on this genetic research, has explained, there is currently no evidence of genetic continuity connecting either of these ancient populations directly to people living in Britain today. Based on current genetic evidence, Europe has experienced at least 5 separate, distinct population replacement events since the Magdalenian woman at Gough's Cave was alive, layer after layer of migration, replacement, and renewed migration, each one substantially reshaping the genetic ancestry of the people living across the continent. This raises a genuinely important question worth sitting with carefully. What actually happened to the original Magdalenian population that first resettled Britain nearly 500 years earlier than scientists previously believed? The most likely explanation connects directly back to the same climate forces that brought them to Britain in the first place. The specific herds of reindeer and horses these Magdalenian hunters depended upon for survival were themselves highly sensitive to shifting vegetation and climate conditions. As the broader European climate continued fluctuating throughout this turbulent post-Ice Age period, sometimes warming considerably, other times plunging back into brief, sharp cold spells, the specific ecosystems supporting these particular prey animals appear to have repeatedly shifted, expanded, and contracted. Populations dependent on these specific migratory herds for their entire way of life would have been forced to follow their prey elsewhere, or, in the harshest scenarios, may have simply failed to survive these repeated environmental disruptions at all. There is something genuinely humbling and genuinely moving about sitting with this particular piece of British prehistory carefully. The people who first pushed back into Britain, tracking herds of reindeer and horses across a landscape only recently freed from glacial ice, nearly 500 years earlier than we previously gave them credit for, represent a genuine chapter of pioneering human achievement. They successfully adapted to survive within one of the most challenging environments imaginable, crossing a vanished land bridge into unfamiliar territory, carving out a genuinely sophisticated culture, complete with elaborate tools, artistic tradition, and complex, if unsettling, mortuary practices. And yet, within what amounts to little more than a heartbeat in the broader span of human history, that entire population appears to have vanished, leaving behind bones, tools, and carved skull, cups, but no living genetic descendants who carry their bloodline forward into the present day. It would take yet more time, and at least one further wave of population change, before Britain's genetic story eventually connected to people living there today. The population most closely associated with modern British ancestry doesn't fully enter this story until considerably later. with a well-known individual called Cheddar Man, discovered, remarkably, within that very same Gough's Cave, though dating to a period roughly 10,500 years ago, nearly 5,000 years after the original Magdalenian woman studied in the same cave had lived and died. Genetic analysis of Cheddar Man reveals he belonged to the same broader Western hunter-gatherer population first identified at Kendrick's Cave, with roughly 85% of his ancestry tracing back to that same Villa Bruna genetic cluster, and only a small remaining fraction connecting back to the earlier, largely vanished Magdalenian population. This means Britain's genuine, continuous genetic thread connecting back toward people living there today runs primarily through this second wave of settlement, the Western hunter-gatherer population first identified at Kendrick's Cave, rather than through the earlier Magdalenian pioneers whose arrival researchers have now dated nearly 500 years earlier than previously assumed. The very first people to successfully resettle Britain after the Ice Age, the population whose historic achievement this new climate research has just pushed back even further into the past, are not, in any meaningful genetic sense, Britain's true ancestors at all. They are instead a genuinely lost bloodline, a remarkable pioneering population whose accomplishment in reaching Britain so early deserves genuine recognition, even though their direct genetic legacy did not survive to become part of the ancestry carried by anyone living in Britain today. So when we say humans returned to Britain 500 years earlier than scientists previously thought, we are describing something considerably richer and more layered than a single, simple date correction. We are describing the opening chapter of a story involving pioneering settlement, sophisticated culture, ritual practice, and ultimately disappearance, followed by an entirely separate population arriving later, carrying an entirely different genetic heritage, one that would eventually contribute meaningfully to the ancestry of Britain as we understand it today. Two distinct populations, separated by roughly 1,500 years and by an entirely separate genetic lineage, both calling the same small stretch of British landscape home, one leaving behind no descendants at all, the other becoming eventually one thread among many woven into the deep ancestral tapestry of the British Isles, somewhere beneath the limestone cliffs of Cheddar Gorge, and within the quiet sediment layers of a Welsh lake that has patiently recorded 19,000 years of shifting climate, lies the true story of Britain's earliest human return, a story of pioneers who arrived earlier than we ever gave them credit for, who built a genuinely sophisticated culture within one of history's harshest environments, and who then quietly and almost completely disappeared, leaving behind only bone, stone, and the faintest genetic echo, waiting patiently for modern science to finally listen.